In this video, I will be teaching you how to make music like Marshmello. First, we'll be recreating Happier featuring Bassline. And later, we'll take this one step further and use this as inspiration to create a track of our own. For me, the final result is my new single, Ecstatic, which at the time of posting this video is out now on all major platforms. Click the link in the description to check it out if you'd like. But ultimately, what we'll learn is how to create music like Marshmello. Real quick, before we get into the meat of this video, I wanted to give a shout out to today's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community for creators, and viewers of my channel will love what they have to offer. Let's face it, if you've landed on this video, you're the type of person looking to learn. Now, you could learn how to replicate the style of a musician who dresses up like a piece of candy by following along with some random guy's tutorial on the internet. Or you could learn how to make music from certified professionals. But I'm sure the YouTube video's still pretty good. But you can do so by checking out one of the more than 25,000 classes Skillshare has to offer on topics such as music, design, technology, and more. Skillshare's premium membership gives you unlimited access, so you can join whichever community you so desire. Plus, Skillshare is super affordable. An annual subscription comes down to be less than $10 a month. And on top of that, if you use the link in the description below, you will get a 2-month free trial. So join the more than 7 million creators learning with Skillshare today. Whether you want to fuel your curiosity, creativity, or even career, Skillshare is the perfect place to keep you learning and thriving in today's modern world. Thank you so much for supporting this video and channel, Skillshare. Now, let's jump into learning how to make music like Marshmello. Hello there, my inspirations. My name is InspirAspir, and as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, today I'll be teaching you how to make music like Marshmello. So introductions aside, let's jump right into it. What you see here before me is my Ableton live session where I recreate Happier. So what you'll want to do is create a new session in whatever DAW you'll be following along with. Now, Happier is set at 100 BPM and will be in a key of F major. So let's go ahead and learn how to make the drop of Happier. And to start, let's focus on the percussion. Here is my final layer of percussion, what we'll be creating. Which is comprised of 4 main layers. We have our kicks, snares, cymbals, and hi-hats. Let's focus on our kicks to begin with. To create my layer of kicks in Ableton, I added a drum rack onto a new MIDI layer. Now, I wanted to remain as faithful to Marshmello as I possibly could, so I went to hunting specifically for Marshmello samples. Credit where credit's due, I came across this really awesome sample pack by Ultrasonic. I'll leave a link in the description below if you want to go check it out and download it for yourself. But this pack contained a bunch of samples and even serum presets that I used when recreating Happier. I added in a bunch of samples that I liked from the sample pack, and I stacked them on top of each other and laid them out in this following pattern. On top of this kick layer, be sure to add in some audio effects to really boost your kicks. I added a glue compressor so these 3 samples mingle well together, and I added in one of Ableton's default EQs. Under Audio Effects, EQ8 Drums, I added in Kick EQ3. This just boosts the low ends, the punchy feel of the kick, a little bit of the high ends for some brightness, and you lose a little bit right here in the middle in these kind of unnecessary territories and these frequencies. Next, let's move on to our snares. Now, this piano roll may look a little bit complicated, but let's break it down layer by layer. It's not too crazy. I did the same thing as my kicks here, where in Ableton, I added a new MIDI track, I added a drum rack on top of it, and then I found the samples that I liked that I wanted to use for my snares. Now, this can just be broken down into 2 different segments, my main snares and supplementary snares. These right here are considered to be my main snares. Let's go ahead and get rid of everything else for now, just so we can focus on these main snares. They're laid out in this following pattern. Next, I went to adding in the supplementary snares, which add a little bit of rhythm to our beat. These snares right here add the Marshmello trap vibe to the song. I I didn't add too much audio effects onto my snares layer, just an EQ, again, one of Ableton's built-in stock EQ8 presets, snare EQ2. I probably could do more, but for the sake of demonstrating how to recreate this song from scratch, it did just fine, perfectly fine. Next, let's focus on our layer of cymbals. This is also pretty straightforward, and again, split into just 2 segments. First, we have our normal cymbals, our rides, which hit at every beat. And then the second segment, nothing too crazy, is just one larger crash, a bigger ride at the top of every 4 bars. So essentially when our loop repeats, we just have one big impact. All together so far. Sounding pretty good. Now let's move on to our hi-hats. This is probably the most complicated layer of our percussion, so let's break it down, really dissect this so it's not as overwhelming. I've gone ahead and deactivated some notes just so we can focus on this first layer of hi-hats right here. These are our main closed hi-hats. These hit fast and short, and quite frankly, I think are what brings out the most Marshmello of the track. When I created these, I just laid them out in one singular line like this. But you'll notice that there are some gaps in these hi-hats, and this is where I later added in other elements just to add some variation. And I really did just sort of randomly add in holes in our first set of hi-hats. Added these guys in to fill in those gaps just as variation. You'll notice this layer of hi-hats has a consistent pattern, and this one just filled in those gaps that I chose at random. Next, you'll notice there's another layer of hi-hats, which has the same pattern as this layer right here, just offset. So this also hits at every beat, similar to our cymbals. It's subtle, but if you really listen for it, you can tell it's there. I also have this layer of hi-hats. So you can see how I started with one basic pattern and expanded upon it just to add in variation where I felt like it needed it. Lastly, I have a fairly important layer of hi-hats. These are the hi-hat rolls. So that'll do it for percussion. Next, let's move on to our bass. My bass consists of 2 different layers. I have my main, heavier bass, and I have a sub bass. Now this is the bass line to happier. On this layer, I added in a new instance of Serum, which if you're curious, our bass line sounds like this. Then for the sake of time, I used a preset. If you remember, I pointed out the ultrasonic Marshmello preset pack, which I went to using. I found this preset bass down, which sounds like this. Okay, so that doesn't sound great. So I went to raising this by an octave or 2. And while granted, I know the original track isn't very bass heavy, at least not this gritty, that's where you can start to see this isn't meant to be a recreation. I guess for the tutorial's sake it is, but rather, when you're making this for your own sake, you're using this as inspiration. You're making a track that sounds like Marshmello. So this is where you can take creative liberties, you know, in the sound design, for example. On this layer of bass, I added in an EQ. This is to cut off the super low ends. This is where my sub bass will be taking up space. And the most important audio effect on this layer of bass is a camel crusher. This is a free preset, I do believe, that really compresses your sound. It distorts it like crazy. So this is how I get the bass to sound gritty and powerful without Camel Crusher, and then with it. Specifically, I used the preset British Crunch and tweaked with it slightly. Next, let's move on to our sub bass. Now, sub basses by default take up the low ends, the low frequencies. These are the sounds that you almost can't even hear, although yes, you can, but rather you feel instead. This is the rumble of your bass. So I just created a new MIDI track and copied my MIDI clip from before. And again, I used an instance of Serum to create my sub bass. Let's go ahead and lower this by a few octaves. And then create a sub bass. In this case, for the sake of time, I used an 808 preset. If it doesn't sound right, again, tweak with the octave levels. As far as audio effects go, I used a utility to make my sub bass mono. We don't really want our sub bass to take up stereo space, so just turn it into mono. And finally, an EQ. This is almost the polar opposite of the EQ on our main bass, where the layers that we cut out we're now focusing on. So now our sub bass. So that means altogether both of these layers sound like this. Which is good, but a little bit overwhelming. So I grouped these two tracks together to try and make them mesh nicely. So on our grouped track of these two layers, I added in an EQ, a glue compressor to mix these two layers together, and maybe most importantly, two instances of side chaining, one tied to our kick layer and one tied to our snares. So altogether, here's what we have so far. Which is sounding really good. So now let's go ahead and add in our layer of leads. Our layer of leads will sound like this. Which is more or less just the same layer duplicated and then slightly altered. So let's go ahead and break that down. First, we have what I consider to be the main lead. Let's remove all the audio effects and break this down from the beginning. This is an instance of Serum emulating what is a staccato violin pluck. If you're curious, I replicated this by finding a preset pack called Echo Soundworks. They have this large pack of Serum presets where many of them are meant to emulate real instruments. So in this case, I found a very nice string sound that I was looking for. On this layer, I added in a plethora of audio effects, but the most notable being some reverb, some compression, EQ, a slight bit of Camel Crusher, all laid out in succession to create a sound like this. So while I know I kind of glossed over that, essentially all you're doing is really just compressing this sound to brighten it up a little bit, bring it out, a slight bit of reverb to give the sound some space, and some EQ to isolate the frequencies that you want. Now the rest of the layers in this are just the same thing, almost duplicated, maybe just audio effects slightly altered. Which you saw as I jumped back and forth there is almost identical, just EQ'd so there's less low ends, it's just the higher ends, and it's a slight bit more wet, it has more reverb. So this is to make the leads sound more airy and spacious. I also have this layer of leads. Again, for the same exact concept. And finally, I do have this layer of leads, which is slightly different. This is almost a emulated brass sound. Same thing as with my bass, I grouped all my leads together and added in some audio effects to make them play well together. I have a glue compressor for the same reasons as before. I have an EQ to cut off the low ends. This is where my bass will shine through. And again, the same two instances of side chaining, one to my kick and one to my snares. And they're slightly tinkered with so that they work differently on my layer of leads rather than on my bass, but the same concept is there. So again, one more time, all of my leads sound like this. And lastly, I do have one more notable layer, which is just a layer of white noise. This was just made in Ableton by adding in an analog instrument, dragging it on top, and turning the shape of my oscillators into this wiggly sneaky boy. This just leaves me with static white noise. I added an EQ on top of this to isolate the very, very, very high ends. I don't want anything below to get muddled in with the rest of my song. So what this does is fill in a range of frequencies in your track that you don't actively pick up on, but you'll notice if it's taken away. If it's not there, something doesn't quite feel right. So let's play what we have together without the white noise, and then halfway through, let's turn it on and see if we can tell a difference. And there you have it. For the most part, that is how you recreate Happier. Now, what I went ahead and did is use this as inspiration and turned this into my own track. Something about going through layer by layer, creating everything, trying to mirror the sound design, really sparked something in my mind that I then went ahead and went off on a tangent and created. So you can tell here in the same exact Ableton session, I have this layer here, which is Happier, and then I have what is a seemingly identical layer over here, but in fact, this is the basis, the foundation of my new track, Ecstatic. But the point is, here's what I used as inspiration to turn into a full-length track of my own. First things first, I kept my BPM. Secondly, I changed keys. I changed my scale to, I believe, A sharp minor. You can tell from my bass line, I have a similar layout, but I rewrote the melody. One, in my new key, and two, I think I changed some of the pattern, slightly. You can tell the highlighted notes, for example, are Happier, and what's not highlighted is my version for Ecstatic. So you can tell there's similarities. Obviously, there's inspiration, of course. However, it's different enough of its own. And I think it later went on to add in some glide, for example, that's not quite shown here, but you get the point. The lead melody. So this then is the project for Ecstatic. One of the first things you may notice is I actually have Marshmello and Bastille Happier right here as a reference track, because again, I was using this as inspiration. I was basing the feel of the song off of this track. So then in this project, here's my expanded version of the Happier drop. The main differences here being there's actually more significant effects, in this case risers and downfalls, to add in the transitions. And one of the most important layers is this group of backup vocals. Now, if you listen to Happier very closely, you can tell there's background vocals going on in the track. And I didn't emulate that in my recreation. However, for Ecstatic, I tried to make something similar. So I do have this layer of backup vocals going on. Which is just heavily modified and processed versions of me going, ooh. And if you listen to the track again, you can definitely hear this in the mix. And from there, when I had a chorus that I liked and I could work with, I just expanded and turned this into a track of my own. Again, using Happier as a reference for song structure. At first, it was just meant to be a replica, a copy of an already existing song. But then at some point, it evolved into a form of its own. And again, one last shameless self-promotion. If you'd like, you can click the links in the description below to go check out the full version for yourself and maybe get a feel for how this entire process evolved over time, starting from Happier and turning into Ecstatic. So that'll do it. I hope you guys learned something. Maybe this could be some inspiration of your own. I appreciate you watching, and I will see you in the next one. Go check out Ecstatic, okay? Bye.